Hi, thank you everybody who's come to the talkPOPc's event. Today we're going to discuss Lewis Gordon's book, Fear of Black Consciousness. We're tying this into our sort of larger conversation about power. So let me just sort of tell people a little tiny bit about talkPOPc's and what we do. It stands for Philosophers Ontological Party Club. And so it's both an art and philosophy kind of organization. And this started several years ago when I kind of realized that I was producing both books and artwork on the same topic. And so that topic was nominalism, and we are now at our fourth topic, which is power. And we do a kind of a variety of things. Sometimes we do like full-scale exhibitions that we do, where we also have our signature tent where we have one-to-one conversations. And in that tent, that gets uploaded to our podcast. So if you ever want to do one-to-one conversations, Lois just did a few nearby. And so if you ever want to do that, let us know. We do it constantly. So let me sort of jump into what we're doing here with power. The last meeting that we have here, and we come once a month to Liz's boudoir. They're wonderful to host us every time. We were doing Miranda Fricker, Epistemic Injustice. And so I want to read, if I get a pair of glasses, excuse me, the quote.
Actually, a pair of glasses relate to the question of power.
Yeah, right. And the diminishing amount, right? All right, so this seems to me sort of in a way to tie it in. This is Miranda Fricker's Epistemic Injustice. In the context of a racist ideology structured around dogmas of white superiority, the fundamental ethical sentiment of plain human sympathy becomes disfigured in the eyes of whites so that it appears as little more than an indicator of self-perceived advantage on the part of the black subject. A black man is not allowed to have feelings that imply a position of any sort of advantage relative to any white person, no matter how difficult or lonely her life might be. Okay, so what this is referring to, if you guys remember To Kill a Mockingbird, if you guys remember the trial, right? So this girl, right, very, very poor girl, right, lies about what she was doing at that time. And no one will believe the black man that she's accused, right? And everyone feels compelled to believe her, right? So this is like 1940s, something like that, right? The trial is a zero-sum contest between the word of a black man against that of a white girl, or perhaps that of her father, who has brought the case to court. And there are those on the jury for whom the idea that the black man is to be epistemically trusted and the white girl distrusted is virtually a psychological impossibility. So the point to the Fricker thing was that we tend to believe some people and trust their point of view more than we trust other people's point of view. That's the epistemic injustice. Okay, so now I wanted to just read a little quote from Lewis's book, Fear of Black Consciousness. Quote, in countries across the world, what most people have not come to terms with is the distance between the quality of life afforded to even working class white and that afforded to most black and indigenous peoples. Take the city of Boston, Massachusetts, a city not short of white resentment, where in 2017, the median net worth of white households was valued at $247,500. For the city's historic black population, and this is not a typo, the median household net worth was $8. So, yeah, I actually double-checked that data before I wrote it down. 100% right. 100% right. That's actually the statistics. So, so I thought we would kind of just open this up today, and Lewis is going to talk a little bit about his book, and then we'll open it up to everybody else and, whatever comments that you want to make about it.
Thank you, Dana.
Yes, of course.
And thank you all for popping up this afternoon. Hey, pop.
Yeah.
Well, first I want to say, wanna kisuk? You ever heard that expression?
No.
No? Well, wanna kisuk is wampanoag. That's how you say hello. That's how the pilgrims were greeted. Wanna kisuk. When they landed in what is now Massachusetts. And we could say hotep. We could say shalom, assalamu alaikum. It's rather striking because when we hear shalom, assalamu alaikum, it's often translated as peace. If you imagine you meet someone, you say peace. Today, when you say peace, people think about the absence of war. But peace did not used to mean that about war. Peace used to mean something else. Shalom is from Shlomo, which means to make whole. So to wish someone peace is to wish them to be made whole. And to be made whole doesn't mean like complete, but it means fulfilling, have a good life. So there's something really cool about wishing on others a good life. In a way, it connects it to the question about conflicts, because if more people had good lives, maybe the world would have a lot less war. Who knows? But, and Hotep also means peace. So thank you all for popping up. And yeah, it's this book, Fear of Black Consciousness. It's rather cool. The artists there are different editions. In other countries, the way people think about it, some are rather snazzy with all kinds of images. But I actually like this one
I like that a lot.
because of the ambiguity. You don't know if the fear is the glowing blackness or the receding whiteness or the other way around. And that's so I really like this cover. Anyway, I'll just say two things because it would be wonderful for a lot of you to get to speak to, and also Dana had some rather wonderful questions. The first thing I was going to say is Dana brought up power. So I'm just going to give you a definition of power because I found that most people talk about power without defining it. In this book, I give a definition of power, which I'm just going to say right here. Okay? Power is the ability to make things happen with access to the conditions of doing so. It doesn't matter how many abilities you have. If you don't have access to the conditions, nothing will happen. You see? So, for instance, when Dana was going for her glasses, the whole point is that's a condition. Having her eyes have abilities to see, but without the condition of adjusting the vision, you won't be able to see or read. This is a very crucial thing about power because sometimes, especially today, people talk about power in an in-advance negative way because they only think about power over others or dominating others. But what they forget is a very important question. What would life be if you had no power? Well, ultimately, life without any power, without any ability to make things happen, you wouldn't be able to get through it. In fact, you'd be dead. So the basic first premise is that power is a very good thing. Okay? It's the abuse of power that's a bad thing. So what is the abuse of power? The abuse of power is when you're going to make the conditions only available to some people and keep it from most. If, for instance, only some people can have glasses, then a lot of people won't be able to see. Or if some people would have enough food, then then the majority of people would be weak, right? Because they just don't have the energy. So one of the things we have to understand is the concept of empowerment. Empowerment is giving people the access to the conditions. That's what it's about. If people don't have those conditions, nothing happens. Now, it doesn't follow that people don't abuse things, but if you look at all forms of abuse, they take the form of trying to hoard conditions. That's what we're dealing with now globally. There are people right now who are hoarding conditions, and they're increasing poverty. They're increasing the limits of how people can move around. They're creating at a mass level something that diminishes the power of others. Okay? So in the end, even if you're going to see yourself politically, if you're going to fight for political change, what you're ultimately fighting for is for a lot of people to have more power. In fact, that's what democracy ultimately means. Democracy means you maximize power available for people to make things happen. And if you think about it, privatization is to take away from many people, from the public, the ability to make things happen. And that's why as the world becomes more privatized, people not only become poorer, but also people begin to have a feeling, a sense, and it's not just in their head, of powerlessness. Imagine for a second if the world had no nation states, right? If everybody could move wherever they want, right? Then if you think about it, If somebody doesn't like how things are in one place, they just go to another. But if they could do that, they will have a power to go where they can have better conditions. One of the reasons there is, if you look at transnational corporations or transnational individuals, they don't worry about passports or any of those things because they can go wherever they want. But for a lot of other people, the very construction of some people is illegal, makes them vulnerable, because it means now they enter other places at the mercy of those legal systems. And what they have to go through is what a lot of other people don't have to go through, they have left behind. So in this book, Powers Are Good. Okay? Short version of what this book is about. It's called Fear of Black Consciousness. And once you say fear, right? But it's also about a thing called bad faith. And bad faith is when people flee a displeasing truth, they leap into the arms of a pleasing falsehood. So it's a book about lies. And one of the lies that dominate, one of the lies that people are seduced into is connected to something that many people fear. And what do you think the thing is that most people fear? A lot of people. Well, it requires a drum roll. I know, but ultimately, there are a lot of people who fear reality.
Yeah.
Reality.
Oh, yeah.
Oh yeah.
Put your head in the sand. Don't pay attention.
Yeah.
Don't talk to me about it. Everything's fine.
Really good.
I feel safe. That's all I'm, just boom.
That's right.
Yep.
So ultimately, what Black consciousness is about is reality. Okay? If you think about it, a lot of what a racist society is built on is a set of lies. First of all, the very notion that someone is born a superior human being is a lie. It's just weird.
It's weird.
It's really weird.
Yeah.
But somehow you have to build up a lot of edifice, to convince people of that
I
lie.
agree.
So that lie is a twin.
Whole bunch of currency.
The lie of white supremacy is a lie. But there's also another lie, which is the lie of intrinsic black inferiority. So anti-black racism is a lie. You can get rid of white supremacy and still have anti-black racism. Everybody else just say, let's get together and hate black people. Easy. But the very notion that just as it's a lie that you're born in superior, it's a lie that you're born inferior. So, and as lies, that means they're not in touch with reality. Okay? So, in order to maintain these lies, okay, it's not only, and this is a tricky thing about lies, we're used to lies that are more directly aware and manipulative. But that's different. Those lies are easy to talk about. You know what I mean? If someone's just going to try to just get you to do things by telling you, they have the money or they got your back, and as they creep away, that's easy. But the more difficult lies are the lies we tell ourselves. So the important question is, why do we lie to ourselves? And some of those lies, in some cases, help us. Not all lies. This is the part that's tricky, right? For instance, if somebody were to kidnap you, sit you down, and take out the tools and are ready to torture you, right? There's a lie you want to tell yourself. And the lie you want to tell yourself is, I am not my body. Because the suffering you're about to go through, you need to be outside of your body. But that is a lie. Because disembodiment is not part of reality. If anybody asks, where are you? The answer is there, there, there. You're there. But you don't want to be fully there when you're going through suffering. So there's nothing, in other words, morally wrong with that lie. However, when you tell lies that facilitate your ability to diminish the humanity of another, right? Many people don't want to live with the image of themselves with that lie. So they lie to themselves. about their superior. They have to make themselves believe that the people they're harming deserve it. So many of the lies against black people, for example, are lies to convince a lot of non-black people, usually people called white, that black people deserve those things that happen to black people. But there's a lie that's told to many white people. And the lie that's told to many white people is that they're perfect and pure. Now, there are people in this room right now who are legally designated white. Now, are you going to tell me when you go to the toilet it doesn't stink? Are you going to tell me that you have the answers to everything? Are you going? You see what I'm getting at? What every white person as a human being knows is that the notion of being perfect by virtue of being white is a lie. So, and this is a big problem to consider because a lot of discourses on race and racism, although they're fighting against racism, they also impose lies. You see what I'm saying? And one of the lies that's imposed in the two directions I talked about is the lies in which the humanity of people is erased. In other words, when we forget that white people are people and black people are people. You see, when indigenous people are people, then brown people are people. Pick any category. Ultimately, we're talking about people. And I'm going to stop after this because then we continue. There's a part of this book where I talk about invisibilities. Most people just talk about invisibility like, people don't see me. But there's a kind of invisibility when people oversee you. When people look at you and to see you is to see too much. That actually erases your humanity. So I talk about, for instance, racialized lie. A racialized lie is a lie of quantity. And if you look carefully at the discourses on black people, there are always, always too many black people. Even if there's just one black person in the room. Because once you say that a person's illegitimate, then one of them is one too many. But there's another lie, and there's a lie that conflates and treats everything as the same, but they're not the same. There's a lie, for instance, about in what time do people belong. And that's a lie that's imposed upon indigenous or native peoples. Because if you're a settler people, you want to say the indigenous people belong to the past, which means the future only belongs to the settlers. So, but the problem is the indigenous people are still around. There's still indigenous New Yorkers walking around Manhattan and Brooklyn. So what do you call something that belongs to the past, but is present? You call them ghosts. And so there's an experience, if you're a Native American, of being a ghost. You're real, you're there, but you're treated as if you belong to the past. But that's a different experience than the quantity one. Then there's another one. There's a kind of a lie that basically says you must, that anytime you speak, it's illegitimate. And there are many people who could have that lie. But the people I have in my research seen that lie imposed on the most, what category do you think it is? I mean, some of you might have read the book, but those who haven't, what do you think it would be? Woman. How many of you can name 3 books written by a man with the word voice in the title? Okay, how about 2 books? How about 1? Okay, how many of you can name a book written by a woman with the word voice in the title? Okay.
He's got one.
Huh?
He's got one.
I can't see. Yes.
Voice from the South.
Alex! Yes, Anna Julia Cooper. In a different voice, Carol Gilligan.
Yeah.
Right?
That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
In fact, the only book I can think of there are some books by a man, but and again, these are fluid categories. Sometimes men occupy them. Voices from the Bottom of the Well, Derek Bell. Right? So, but the reason this is so is because politics requires having a voice. So in a society that says power, remember we talked about power? Politics and power meet if women are not to have power, but politics is the public articulation of power through speech, then when women, what we call speak, the idea is not to listen, which means they're not heard, so there's no voice. And that's a form of invisibility. And the last connects to Miranda Fricker, which is epistemic invisibility. The idea that's where you say whatever those people say is illegitimate by virtue of them saying it. And that could pertain to any other group. Now there's a lot more, but I think that could kick us off.
That's great. Thank you. Can I add just a tiny little bit? You talk a little bit in the book, and I think it's worth kind of mentioning that the contrary notion of white consciousness imposes itself as the universal standard. And so, this is what it's like to be X, right? Becomes then standard for everybody, even though it's not. And so I think that that's kind of a nice, important contrast there, like whose voice gets heard and whose voice gets to be the criterion.
You are correct.
Yeah.
So,
All right.
I was going to say, actually, just a quick point off of what you just said about creating a standard based on whiteness. I just learned this very recently. I mean, it's sort of obvious, but I just learned the specifics of it, that the standard sizes for clothing these days are based off of a study that was done in the 1950s where they took sizes. This one woman, I'm forgetting her name, but this one woman took the sizes of a whole group of women of every size, of every race, of every background, and then threw out everybody that wasn't white and only based the sizes on the white women. And so that's why all the sizes these days seem to only fit thin white women, because she decided to make this perfect, like, white woman as the standard for everybody. And now, like, she intentionally, like, disregarded every other body type of any other ethnicity or race or anything like that, because she wanted to make this perfect white standard, because that's what she thought. And those are still what we base sizes on these days for clothing. So
That's interesting.
yeah.
Well, one of the things about standards we should remember, though, is, and it's interesting because this meeting has the word ontology in it.
Mm-hmm.
One lie is when we make a standard ontological. Standards are actually fluid.
Very fluid.
You see, what's interesting, and I don't have to get into race or gender or class for this. I could pick something as simple as music. Every one of you have heard the beginning of the Fifth of Beethoven. Da 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 da, right? If you listen to a recording, right, from the early 20th century of that beginning, you would say it's too slow. It was da 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 da. And that's because you have to remember, a little more than 100 years ago, or if you go even to 150 years ago, there were people thinking that if you went over 25 miles an hour, you would evaporate. So speed was different. Time was different. Think about how the world was when people used to send a letter and are waiting 6 to 9 months for a response and then answer. I remember even in my lifetime, in my childhood, I write my grandmother when she was living on another island, and how happy I was when nearly 6 weeks later I got a letter back, and then I wrote her. This was an exchange, and think about it. I had to think for 6 weeks about it, right? Now, if someone texts and they don't get it back within, a second or email, they're like, "Yo, what's up?" So, and when time shrinks, right? The amount of time, space begins to shrink too. So our spatio-temporal reality is different from many of our ancestors, although we have the same brain, basic hardware, okay? And so standards go through similar things. But the mistake we make is when we think a standard is permanent.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting because I come from.
Oh, please say your name for the others.
Oh,
'cause
sorry. My name is
They
Isaiah.
got my name.
My name is Isaiah. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. I think it's interesting because I am, for lack of better words, a mixed person. I have so many different. I have white. I have black. I have Native American. I have some Indian, European, etc., right? And to your point about standards, and as you talk about it, I think it's interesting because I have to decide who I want to be on a moment by moment basis. You know, so when you talk about fear of black consciousness, that black consciousness is also a variation of different of what can be black or what characterizes different types of consciousness or how I myself choose to be at a moment by moment basis.
How you present yourself.
So,
Well, you know what's very weird too is another lie that I give criticisms of on this book is the lie that you must be one thing. Raise your hands. How many of you have seen a race walking? How about a gender walking? You see how incoherent that is? A class. You know, no. We're multiple manifestations. And you know,
That's Hume's. Remember, try to imagine a triangle,
yeah.
because you can't do it. Yeah.
And so part of what we are multidimensional. You know, we are part of reality multidimensionally. You see? And you know, and one of the things that we should bear in mind is that when people are invested in possibility, so there are all kinds of lies about, for instance, that if you're mixed, people love to present mixed people as a war. You know, oh, I'm not white enough. I'm not. Yeah. It's funny. Where I'm from, where I was lucky to have a childhood before I came to the United States when I was 9. But where I'm from in Jamaica, one thing I noticed, I talk about in this book, is a country is different when its national identity is black versus if its national identity is white. And one of the reasons for that is because a national identity as white has a lie of purity. You see? So and the thing about so it has all these things that you have to wipe away. A national identity of black actually doesn't have purity. Because when you go and see black communities, there are a whole bunch of people. To be black, you could be with any group and be black. But it doesn't mean that group isn't there. So my family, in my childhood, when I looked at them, they were Jews from Jerusalem in the 19th century, right? So at that time, they would say they're Palestinian Jews. They were Jews from Ireland, Shannon, in the 19th century. They were Tamil Indians, 19th century, because British Empire, so nationally were out. Chinese from Guangdong, China. They were Beta Israel Jews or Ethiopian Jews. They were Liberians, okay? And the name's Gordon it'd be Scottish, I tell you. So it's Scots from Aberdeen. Now, here's the thing. And we have a person here who's familiar with Jamaica. It would look like this room, and Kojo, what would all of them say they were?
The one many.
But they would say they were black.
Yes.
But what they mean by black is something very different. You see what I'm saying? They didn't look at being, so I could have a blonde, blue-eyed relative who would say, I am black. Because in your head, right now, if I said the word Jamaican, did you think of a white person? Nobody thinks of a white person. In February, I was going to give a lecture in Jamaica, and I got on the plane, and I had to use the bathroom, and I was going, somebody tapped me on the shoulder, and he said, excuse me, brother, could you pass me some tissue from the bathroom? And when I turned around, it was a blonde, blue-eyed man. And I just started crying up, right? Because, yeah, I was like, oh, I'm going to Jamaica. He's a Jamaican. I'll tell you a story. One time, I went to JFK, right? This was many years ago, my first time going to India, okay? So, and I had to connect in Abu Dhabi. So I get on the plane, and there was a woman sitting next to me, right? And she was Bengali. But she went to Purdue University, so she's been in the United States a while. So we had a conversation. So from her point of view, she's only talking to a black person. When I connected in Abu Dhabi to go to Trivandrum and Kerala, I sat down, and there was an elderly couple next to me. They looked at me and smiled, and they said, coming home for the holidays. So then I landed in Trivandrum and I went to get a rickshaw. And when I went, a guy looked up and he goes, "Are you Arab?" And I said, "Why do you ask?" He said, "No, no, I thought you were Arab." So I go to give my lecture. And I got on the stage and I said, "Okay, so I left the United States black, I connected Tamil, and I arrived Arab." And then I said, "But here's the thing, all are true." You see my point? Like if I asked you, what percentage of you is say your ethnic identity versus your gender identity, or your racial identity versus your caste? Well, you see how incoherent it is. We can be 100% more than one thing. And so the lie is to make us convinced that we could only be such. And a lot of people from the US buy into the lie. And when I tell my children this, at first they're like, "Oh, Dad, you're full of it." No, man. I remember my eldest son, one time we were on a plane and there were some people freaking out. And he was like, "Who's black, Dad?" I said, "I don't think this one's because we're black." And he kept saying, "No, man, we're obviously black because we're black." I don't think so. And then finally this elderly man, because it was a few years after 9/11. And this elderly man came up, it was an Icelandic airline, he goes, "What's up with you North African Arabs? Why are you always doing these jihad and all of this stuff?" And my son just got silent. Because we look like what their understanding is. And there are many, my youngest daughter, she travels a lot now. And I told her this, except for the identity of white, most places I travel, I'm local. Because people can see the connection to who they are. When I'm in India, I'm just Indian. And a lot of people don't understand that India is a collage of many countries, from Dravidians all the way through to all the way up to the north of Punjabi. And it's a complex of people. And similarly, when I'm in the Middle East, there are people who could spot certain elements. The one that blew me away was, and a lot of people don't understand China. China is more diverse than people think. But one that blew me away was one time I was in Indiana, and I was asked to come to the Chinese club. And I was like, started doing the mirror thing, But anyway, that gives you a sense of the next video.
Any thoughts? You can jump in. Go.
It's fascinating to me that you say, sorry, I'm Shrutika. It's fascinating to me that you say that a country that is white has a white leadership, political system was black leadership, and the idea of purity as connected to that, because I'm Indian. We definitely have a culture of purity. We are colorist. I think we've all heard the same notions of like proximity to whiteness being extremely important even in India. But so I'm thinking now about this idea of like purity. Obviously for us it's also connected to caste, it's in class, skin color as connected to caste. So all of that. So I'm thinking of like the political structure in light of what you just said about like how does then race is not the thing, but caste is the thing. They're the same.
I sometimes wonder about that. If the real division isn't class, but race is an easy way to sort of identify class, and people want to keep white people want to keep blacks down as a way to continue to identify a lower economic group.
Yeah.
I wondered about that. What do you think? What do you think the relationship is?
I talk about India in the book.
I'm sure.
For obvious reasons.
For obvious reasons.
There's a lot people don't understand about the history of India. And I talk about, for instance, it's a complicated story, particularly Hinduism. The technical term, for instance, is Vajra. Okay? And if you're dealing with what it's the Portuguese who use the word caste. Okay? But the complicated thing is that, and the whole history of that is even more complicated, because the different indigenous groups of India, what we call India, it wasn't called India then. These were different countries. But if you go even farther back in its history, it's a place of multiple invasions. And some of them were from what is today Iran. Okay? And back then, the Greeks called it Persia. There were different names, and there were all kinds of systems in place. But Iran is a complicated story because that's also, and I talk about that in this book too, because there's some whoppers people don't know. Okay, like here's one whopper. All the people we call whites morphologically, I'm not talking about politically, but morphologically, have only been around 6,000 years. For most of human history, it's just been dark-skinned people. Okay, and a lot of this is connected to agriculture. Okay, so it's a lot, right? Well, what's today Iran and Central Europe was a place in which those are not places in which, for a variety of historical reasons, access to certain forms of vitamin D, they have winters, so forth, it led to people becoming lice. So, and because a lot of people didn't understand ecological management of in terms of agriculture, it also led to periods of starvation where people spread out. So the people we call today whites, historically, were moving into places of just darker people. The people we call blacks, who were from brown to darker skin, had different color eyes, etc. There were blue-eyed black people, stuff like that. I mean, what we call black. They had no reason to call themselves black. They were just people. However, so in India, what we call India, going into the Indus Valley, were these earlier peoples, and it was definitely a light dark thing. Because all the indigenous peoples of what we call India were dark-skinned people. Now, so there were all kinds of ancient systems set in place. Now, what's complicated is because of waves of colonialism. That one, then you have later on the Moguls, it's Muslim groups, and then you have the British, the Christian groups, these waves of groups. A lot began to form Indian identity around Hinduism. But it became complicated because there were people who technically did not belong to our Varna. Okay, which is the right word. But so what do you do with somebody who's now listed as a Hindu, but historically belonged to no Varna? And you now have a new category of people called Dalits, or untouchables. And this is buck wild crazy, right? Because you are literally walking pollution. In fact, you can pollute someone by your shadow. And so I look into a lot of, I cite the work of Dalit writers, okay? But what's complicated, and this is all the way, there's been Dalit activism from Ambedkar all through many others, but the complicated part now is that the Dravidians, the Islanders, a lot of these others, although they're listed, something very weird happens in India. And you probably thought about this, right? If you wonder why in India today there is, it's not just Islamophobia. It's a racialized hatred of Muslims, okay? And for the partition that led to Pakistan, right? The reason is certain people who are in lower Varna or in the category of untouchability converted to Islam or Christianity. So if you are an Indian and you converted, the presupposition is that you're really an untouchable or a Dalit. You see what I'm getting at? Now, why I bring this up is because if you're going to use that logic, right, then technically what should all white people in India be? Technically. Especially if they decide to become Hindu. They should be untouchable. Have you ever met a white untouchable? A white Dalit? Never. And that's weird, isn't it? Because the logic should say that all whites in India should be untouchable. There's no untouchable white in India. So this is why the denial that it's a race category doesn't hold water. It gets even more complicated because if you look during the British rule, a lot of Indians who went to become indentured servants and so forth. Obviously, the reason, for instance, I'm of Tamil ancestry is because of when the British Empire outlawed slavery, they still needed slaves. So they got Asian slaves. They got Indians and Chinese. That's why I'm Indian and Chinese. But it's highly likely, if that's so, if you're from the colonies that way, then it's highly likely your actual ancestry is from a lower Varna or an untouchable. Okay? Or a Dalit. Now, it gets even more complicated, these logics, because even what I describe is a very short version. Because as you know, because you're from India, it's a spectrum. Even internal to Varna, there are a lot of things going on. Which brings us back to the earlier remark. Standards are more fluid than people would say. There's a lot more I could say, but as you know, it could be an entire session just on understanding what is going on in terms of race, caste, right, and caste in Hinduism. But I have to bring it up in here because of a simple thing that's important, and I must say this: the word black in this book does not refer exclusively to people of African descent. You got it? And this is one of the big problems. The reason people talk about black the way they do today is because of empire. Whoever is at the center of an empire is the loudest voice. The U.S. imperialism made African Americans have the loudest voice of blacks. But the truth is, there are black people all over the place. If you're a Koori in Australia, you know what Kooris call themselves? Blacks. If you're Maori, black. All right. There are people in India who are black. There are still people in Ireland. So it's not only the racism here that call certain Irish people black, but in Ireland, there are black Irish. Because a lot of people don't know the historic Irish were actually dark-skinned, etc. And a lot of the light Irish you see today are descendants of Scandinavians coming in.
That's right.
You see? So they're black, and I did not want to write a book that erases those other black people. So I'm very clear in this book that when I say black, I specify which blacks I'm talking about, because each black has a different black story, even though it's all black people, like black Jamaicans. If you're black in South Africa, if you are black in Saudi Arabia, if you're black in Israel, if you're black in China, if you're, each kind of black has a story. And this is part of what the book is about. If I'm going to address lies, I also have to address lies that black people tell black people. And one of the biggest lies is people think their black people are the black people.
Yeah.
And just like there are people who think their white people are the white people. I've been to places where white people don't act like white people in America. And I have to say, at first it was very weird. I'm like,
Can you say where?
I'll give you an example. My very first time going to Belgrade, okay? I get on a plane and it's connecting in Frankfurt. So, everything is normal. I'm the black guy. Now, when I'm at the Frankfurt airport, I noticed there was one other young black guy. He was chilling. This is before the cell phones. This is many years ago. So he had the Walkman, And so I saw all these white people, in my view, getting on the plane to go, to Serbia. So I was there going to Serbia to give lectures. So I'm going to get on the plane, and I go on, and I notice something weird, because we don't realize it, but American race visuality, the visual field of race, gets into our subconscious. So there's a way when people are looking at you but want to look like they're not looking at you, look. And that's when you know they're trying to look like they're not looking at you, because they don't want to say you're a black person and they're a white person looking at you. I didn't see it on the plane. So I thought, this is awful. You know, from the stewardesses to just the people in the plane, it was like I wasn't there, but I wasn't there as invisibility as a human being. I wasn't there in the sense that, who the hell am I? Why am I so special? You see what I mean? I was just some dude. So then the plane lands, and we have to go to customs. Now at that time, this was many years ago, before I became an American citizen. Okay? So, you know, and I went through the whole experience, a lot of what people are going through now, all of the, from the 70s and stuff, horrible stuff. But so there was a part of me, before I became an American citizen, who was really thinking through that. So I was traveling on a Jamaican passport. So I had to get a visa. So I'm going in, and now I had to go to customs. So at this moment, I haven't had the race moment, because people would just be people. So I go up and I said, oh, customs. Time for the race moment. So I gotta put my passport down. And the guy goes, and he looks up at me and goes, I've never seen a Jamaican passport before. I was thinking, you know, he was like, hey, call his friend, look at this. And they were talking about, you know what I mean? They were talking about they weren't looking at my face, or they were trying to look at, he felt so cool that he got a Jamaican passport to look at. And he just grabbed it, welcome to Serbia. And I was like, so then I go hang out in Serbia, in Belgium. And the first thing I know, from my point of view, the people, this is Eastern Europe, and you've been to Eastern Europe, you know what I'm talking about. To me, they look like mixed people. I saw from light to dark, it not look like the way in my day a lot of Puerto Ricans would look. It's just that they were speaking Serbian, right? I mean, just a full range. And then I would give talks and hang out. And every night was wild, because we drink rakia, which is a brandy, and people start dancing on tables, and everything was just, right? So after a while, I'm like, I had to say, you know, when you're coming from the States, you stereotype. In the book, I talk about how we stereotype people as well. Mm-hmm. The stereotype for Eastern Europeans, if you've not been to Eastern Europe, is from American Bond spy movies. Everybody looks like a blonde Russian, you know, you know, women have mustaches, you know, that kind of a thing. And instead you see a vibrant Mediterranean-like society. So I was saying, why does everybody here look like mixed people? And they said, and here's the part that I found very interesting. They said, because they are. I said, well, what do you mean? Well, when it was Yugoslavia, on the communism, they had free education for anybody who came. So a lot of Africans, a lot of South Asians, a lot of East Asians, a lot of Caribbeans came to study. And if you're going to be in a country all the way to the PhD, you know, this thing happened called romance, love. People have married, they have children, they stay. But here's the part that's interesting. Their children weren't here where a mixed child would be just pushed as something separate. They were just Serbs. So the identity of a Serbian did not have a morphological singularity. Mm-hmm. And because of that, they have no reason to think someone who's brown is not a Serb. And they have a different view about a lot of this. So I found what Fanon was talking about in Black Skin, White Mask, which is what I call ordinary anonymity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to go.
What's your name?
Raleigh.
Hi, Raleigh.
I want to go to the point that you brought up about how being being black is not exactly all presented. You know, I think I'm reading through Jack Halberstam's A Queer Time and Place right now, and my favorite point he's brought up so far is the idea of metronormativity, and that being that that in queer communities the metronormative is so standard that it's just how it is. And for me, growing up in the South, it's like I never had a voice, and I feel like I was not. I mean, and then I moved to New York City, and because I'm gay, I'm expected to fit a mold that has been set here, and I find myself, I'm like, I don't fit this mold. I don't fit this mold. I fit the mold that I was kind of like, I was getting punched into back home, but I'm comfortable with that mold. I'm comfortable with not being one way or another. And I really like how, I really appreciate how you did that in your book. I'm Black.
Thank you. In fact, if you want to be curious about what Ronnie's bringing up, I actually take the position that human is a queer category, and that the effort to try to de-queer us, so to speak, I agree with Judge Butler on this issue, is an effort to try to put us into a schema of an ontological standard of normativity. But actually, we don't know ultimately what may fit us at different times in our lives. And in fact, believe it or not, there's an old stodgy philosopher who actually argued this. His name was Arthur Schopenhauer. Arthur Schopenhauer says that we're all basically born, what in today's language would be queer, but then we're pushed into certain roles by adolescence. So, linked to reproduction and stuff like that. But then he says a lot of, and he was a misogynist and had a lot of problems. But he was being very honest. He said, but suddenly he realized as an older man, men start to look a little hot to him again. And that's the fluidity of it, right? And and I usually put it this way, if we take away the script, we don't know where love will lie in our life, right? You may be saying, I'm a manly heterosexual man, blah, 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 and you go to your locker room and you close the door and Jim turns around and suddenly you hear Marvin Gaye, right? And you thought, I just never knew Jim was so hot. And then before and then you're like, right? But then you're always thinking about Jim. And then somebody says, what do you love with Jim? But the point is, we don't know. And again, there are all kinds of regimes that people impose. But one problem, and thank you for bringing that up. There's some people paradoxically are trying to de-queer queer, which is a contradiction. You see, but I raise it, and it's an existential thesis, because the existential thesis, in a nutshell, is there's no such thing as human nature. That a human being is a divergence from nature, which opens up possibilities of the relationships we can have. Yeah. And then there's a lot more I say about it, but absolutely correct. Yeah. Well, you wanted to ask me something about film.
Yeah, I did want to ask you. All right, in your book, you frequently talk about movies. And I was kind of wondering about, what's the motive of bringing in movies all the time to talk about consciousness? That was what I was wondering. That was my question.
Well, Raleigh, you read the book, so you notice I talk about a few films in there. Oh, I thought you read the book. Okay.
No, I mentioned Jack Harlow Times at Queer Time and Place.
Okay, yeah, but I thought you also mentioned this one. No, I thought you also mentioned it.
No, it's
Okay, but okay, here's the thing. I'm not only a philosopher. I'm actually in many disciplines, and among them is classics and archaeology, ancient work, and I also specialize in myths. But one of the problems today is that most people are not introduced to myths in their historic form. So I have to meet people where they're at. I have to take seriously. A lot of people don't even, we're at a bookstore, but a lot of people don't read. But more people go to movies. So if I started with the actual myth in the analysis, for instance, when I was talking about India, there are myths I could appeal to, I could talk about. They go all the way back to what would be ancient Iran, but it wasn't called Iran then, right? And pre-Persian too, right? And in fact, those ancient myths inform a lot of what we have in philosophy, right? But to make it more concrete, it struck me that a better technique would be to pick films that I know a lot of people have seen. Okay? Because then we have a shared text. So I start with the film, but if you read the book, I then talk about the film as a retelling of a myth. And then another myth as a retelling of another myth. Because the word myth is from the word mythos. And the word mythos means from the mouth. Myths were historically told. And the reason they were told is to be retold. So like the Odyssey was sung. Literally people around a fireplace would listen to someone sing the Odyssey. Now, the reason you retell myths is because in retelling, you produce meaning. And this happens with music too. If you listen to the blues, I talk about the blues. Blues retell. And each retelling has a different meaning, though it has a connected meaning. So I'll give you one example. Any of you seen the movie Sorry to Bother You?
No.
Oh, okay. So you haven't seen, okay. Any of you have seen the movie Get Out? Okay. You've all seen the movie Get Out. Well, if you see the movie Get Out, you think about it, you think, wow, that's a really good story. But actually, Get Out is a retelling also of The Wizard of Oz. Yeah. Yeah, from black and white to color. The effort of, right, of the wizard, right, the transplant, all of that stuff. But what is The Wizard of Oz a retelling of? And these are retellings of other myths, where in the book I talk about the myths all the way back to antiquity, to the myth of Isis, Horus, Isis, Horus, and Osiris. No, Osiris and Horus. So these are from ancient African myths. Okay? But the reason I brought up, sorry to bother you, I'll do a spoiler alert, but I'll just mention it. It's worth seeing. It's basically a film about a film about a guy who's trying to get a job, and he ends up working for a place where he opens up a sorry to bother you on the phone, blah, blah, blah. But it makes this weird turn where it turns out there are these people creating these, what they call equisapiens, which is people who are part horse slaves. Okay, so it takes this bizarre thing, right? Now people saw it, they were freaked out. But when I saw it, I had that moment which my kids hate. My kids hate watching movies with me because within 3 minutes, I know the entire movie. And the reason is because I study ancient myths. So once I know the myth, I know what's going to happen. So then people are like, well, why do you watch the movie? Well, the reason is I may know what's going to happen, but I don't know how. So a great movie can bring me there in a different way. So when I saw Sorry to Bother You, I immediately knew what myth it was. So I'll walk you through the myth, just to give you, and the reason is because I want people who read the book want to read more, but also read classic literature. You know, right? Stories that were told over the ages because they were worth retelling. So in Sorry to Bother You, right, it starts off, just to give you an idea, with him sitting for a job interview with a very big trophy. But of course, it's not his trophy, it's a lie. So why this big object? And why does, when they get to a big party, he's meeting people who are turning into horses? Well, it's a retelling of Pinocchio. Pinocchio when he lies.
Yep.
And the island of toys. Remember when the kids play on the island and then they get turned into donkeys and then they're sold into slavery. Right? But what was Pinocchio a retelling of? Pinocchio was a retelling of a novel written in ancient Rome by a fellow by the name of Apollonius, which St. Augustine titled The Golden Ass. Because the Golden Ass was about a guy, again, seeking kind of power, but he's turned into a donkey
Yeah.
and he's sold into slavery. But what was the Golden Ass a retelling of? Remember I said myths are retelling? Well, it was a retelling of a Greek story called the onus. And you all know what the word onus means, right? It's like slavery. It's labor, to carry a burden, the beast of burden. Well, the Greek story was a retelling of an ancient African story because donkeys were domesticated in ancient East Africa, in Kemet. And so the donkey, the beast of burden, is the animal associated with slavery. And that's why many stories about slavery have donkeys in them. So from the ancient world all the way up to a Boots Riley film called Sorry to Bother You, it's the same story. You see? So if you could see those markers, right, you could see why these stories work. Because at your subconscious, because I'm also a professor, I do philosophy of medicine, psychiatry, and psychoanalysis.
So it's a Carl Jung thing,
Well, it's
right?
no, it's more than that.
Yeah.
But because Jung does it as archetypes.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But the reason these stories work is because if stories were absolutely unfamiliar, they would not hook you.
Yeah.
There has to be sufficient familiarity at subconscious level for you to pay attention. So you don't really know why, but those stories are with you, and then the twists of how they tell the stories are there. So if movies work that way, race stories, gender stories work that way too.
Mm-hmm.
That there is a mythopoetics of how we live our identity stories, and they're retold in ways. So the idea is for the reader on her, his, or their own can begin to now learn the art of reading myths.
That's wonderful. You know, that's the perfect place to sort of end and to say thank you to
Thank you.
Lewis Gordon. That was fantastic. Thank you so much.